Odoacer, the brutal man I am engaged to marry, told me of how he and his allies came to rule Dovah. It all began in the kingdom of Ferelden. The year was 6368.
Your Grace, someone has arrived at our gates. He says he's an old friend of yours.
King Dokkan Swiftwater, first of his name, King Ferelden, and the northern region of Thaddeus, was surprised by the news he had just heard. News of an old friend. After the war against Vlad, his friends and family were all dead. All that remained to him was the kingdom he once fought so hard to protect, now barely hanging on by a thread as the forces of Harganeth and Queen Morathi mobilized to invade his lands. 13 years had passed since Dokkan took his throne and the vampire Vlad was defeated at the hands of the Burning Fist. King Dokkan and his loyal vassal Sir Duncan had done their damnedest to keep the Drow forces to the south at bay, launching ambushes and helping the dwarves of Khaz-Karum in the west to defend their lands. But Vlad's ambitions left the kingdom depleted in manpower. Sir Duncan rounded up the peasants at Hobbiton and the other small hovels and settlements throughout King Dokkan's lands to bolster Ferelden's population and military might. But the Drow had thousands of soldiers. King Dokkan knew it was only a matter of time. If only his friends of the Burning Fist hadn't gotten vacuumed into that portal. They all had grown so powerful together. A shame. 6 months prior to the arrival of Dokkan's friend, the Drow attacked the dwarves of Khaz-Karum. Witch Queen Morathi and her army burned the castle to the ground and murdered the royal family. Their surviving dwarves fled and joined with King Dokkan in Ferelden. The prince and the princess of Ferelden were meeting with the dwarfen leaders at the castle during the attack, but luckily they escaped with their lives. Anyway, so Odoacer told me this story in detail after one of his many visits to my cell. Ugh, it's so gross to have this half-orc so close to me and always in my cell. King Dokkan, Queen Genlia, and their council were holding court when the towering double doors to the Ferelden throne room slammed open and a ragged figure entered, slowly walking towards the king.
Impossible. You're dead.
I don't understand what happened, but I've returned. The others, have you seen them? Kevlian, Gragas, Marigold, Zombini.
Dokkan smiled broadly. The loneliness he felt over the last 13 years melted away, and he answered his old friend.
No, Odoacer, I'm sorry I haven't. But it's great to see you. I've missed you all so much. Ruling Ferelden's been lonely. Do you remember anything? Where have you been? Did you see any dragons?
I remember the time I spent serving Zariel and Baitor, but her control over me seems to be broken. Yet, in this body, I don't feel completely normal either.
Odoacer extended his right arm, and it elongated and enlarged to a grotesque size, turning a reddish color.
I still retain some of my devil powers.
His arm returned to normal.
Okay, what about the last 13 years? Where were you?
That, I can't seem to remember. Yet after I sucked into the vortex, I only recall nothingness and darkness.
Things here are quite dire, I'm afraid. Morathi burned Khaz-Karum and executed the king. Vandag and hundreds of dwarf soldiers have joined us here, but the Drow are mobilizing to attack. Sir Duncan's scouts say Harganeth will march on Ferelden in a fortnight.
Morathi? Yes, I remember her.
Odoacer reached back and gripped his axe handle, squeezing it hard with eagerness.
Zombini wanted to slaughter the entire city when we visited. I hate to admit this, but it seems to be correct. Apocalypse!
Odoacer's nightmare materialized from thin air with an aura of flame around it. He leapt onto the steed's back and pulled on the reins, turning and heading backward towards the throne room double doors.
Odoacer, what are you doing? You just got back. Where are you going?
Odoacer stopped. He turned over his shoulder and answered.
I'm paying a visit to Harganeth. I've been gone a long time. I must pay homage to Gramouche.
The streets of Harganeth were bustling as drow soldiers moved to and fro, loading supplies, watering horses, and preparing to set out on their next conquest. All of a sudden, in the middle of the busiest street, bright light and flames erupted out of thin air. Suddenly, a half-orc was sitting atop a flaming steed. The rabble stopped what they were doing, murmuring and whispering in confusion as the half-orc turned his head side to side, surveying those around him.
Orc, what are you doing here? Have you come to die?
Odoacer dismounted and gave Apocalypse a pat on the rump. It subsequently disappeared into thin air. He stepped a few paces and halted, closing his eyes.
Gramouche, Orc god of destruction and the strength, he who never sleeps, he who watches, the one-eyed god, for you I make this offering. I spill elf blood in your name.
The drow looked around confused. Odoacer opened his eyes, and in one fluid motion, he pivoted and spun his body towards the closest drow, drawing his axe. The creature had but a moment before the half-orc's axe swung upward, splitting his prey's face in half from the chin up. The drow soldiers reached for swords and bows, axes and glaives, but Odoacer was already blitzing to his next target. He shouldered into a drow that was trying to draw a short sword from its scabbard. Odoacer pivoted and brought his axe into the air, crashing downward into another elf's cranium, instantly killing it. He turned toward another and butted its face with the end of his weapon, then stomped on its ankle, utterly crushing the bones and ligaments. Odoacer then drew the creature's own dagger and deftly slid the blade into the drow's neck. The bloodthirsty half-orc stared into the elf's fading eyes as blood flowed from the wound. Odoacer released the dagger's hilt and slid back as arrows and bolts whizzed by him. Apocalypse materialized out of nowhere. Odoacer grabbed onto its back, and he and the nightmare were gone. Furious, drow looked all around the area, trying to locate the murderous orc who attacked them so unexpectedly.
Where is that bastard?
Exclaimed a bowman perched high on a guard tower.
Right here.
Odoacer grabbed the drow by his throat and hefted him into the air. The drow gripped desperately at the half-orc's arm as his own eyes filled with blood, and he could hear his spine crackling and snapping.
Gramouche, another offering for you.
Odoacer's body grew and sprouted dark red bat-like wings. His body turned bright red and devilish. He leapt off the guard tower, taking flight. Odoacer hurtled towards the drow below and threw the dark elf corpse he held into a crowded pocket of foes with all of his might. The drow tried to scurry out of the way, but most could not move quick enough and were crushed from the force of their falling dead comrade. In a flash, Odoacer landed in the middle of some disoriented drow and delivered a backhanded fist with one of his giant arms, sending drow soaring through the air, crashing through small buildings and loaded carriages of supplies. Odoacer spun and shrunk back to normal size as he drew his axe again and cleaved another soldier down the middle of her body. 3 drow leapt onto his back simultaneously. Odoacer jerked his head backwards, headbutting the drow directly behind him and knocking the dark elf unconscious. Daggers plunged into Odoacer's ribs from both sides. He roared and shook the 2 drow off. Odoacer snatched the drow standing in front of him into a headlock, then yanked him into the air in a chokehold before snapping the creature's neck. The half-orc attacker dropped the lifeless body into the dirt like a sack of potatoes. Arrows and bolts soared through Odoacer's location, and some struck home. He leapt into the air as his red wings grew from his body and his form turned bright red again. Odoacer took off into the skies. The half-orc devil flew high into the air, then dive-bombed back towards a crowded group of drow, slamming into them with tremendous force. Drow bodies were flung in all directions, and when the dust cleared, Odoacer was slashing, hacking, and cleaving drow back in his normal form. Apocalypse, his flaming steed, was at his side, kicking and crushing elf skulls with its flaming hooves. But before long, the drow focused in on his position again, and projectiles rained down upon him once more. Odoacer had taken many wounds from the projectiles, grabbed the nearest drow by her chain shirt, then put a hand on Apocalypse, re-entering the ethereal plane.
Unhand me! Just wait until Marathi arrives, beast!
Odoacer laughed. Blood flowed from a deep gash above his brow and many other wounds.
Marathi! I've battled that bitch before. Foolish dark elf. And I killed her daughter.
You killed Eldair? Are you, Order of the Burning Fist?
With one quick motion, Odoacer reached to the drow's sword belt and drew his foe's dagger, pressing the blade against his opponent's neck.
Gramoosh, another sacrifice to your greatness and strength.
The blade was pressed hard against the creature's throat, and Odoacer sliced through it with force and savagery. Blood poured out of the drow in waves, and it struggled in his arms, gasping for breath as death overtook it. A feeling overcame Odoacer. Something new. It had been 10 minutes, but Odoacer returned to the street of carnage that he left in his wake. Angry drow glared at the half-orc with hatred and rage, intent on killing him. Something about him was different, though. He had already suffered many wounds during his battle, but now streams of blood flowed from his left eye socket, and the eye itself was missing. A gaping hole in Odoacer's skull replaced the missing left eye. Odoacer explained to me how he was raised to believe his god would grant him tremendous magic power if he sacrificed enough elves. Odoacer looked down at his hands, then he looked back up at the drow. The half-orc smiled. Odoacer pushed his hands outwards, and a fireball came hurtling towards his enemies. Drow screamed, and many dark elf bodies burned to a crisp. Other drow advanced and closed in on Odoacer from both sides. Arrows and bolts flew towards him. Electricity crackled, and a blue aura surrounded the half-orc as he raised his arms. 3 bolts of lightning flew from Odoacer's hands, and 3 more drow fell dead. Odoacer slowly raised an arm and pointed it at one of the encroaching elves. The creature stopped mid-stride. The drow held his chest and screamed as his body disassembled into dust and disintegrated.
Kill him! Kill the orc!
Odoacer closed his eyes and held out his hands. Suddenly, huge shadows covered the battlefield. The drow stopped rushing towards their prey and looked to the sky. Giant orbs of rock and fire seemed to be floating above them.
What's that falling from up above?
Run, goddammit, run! Ah!
Odoacer plunged his arms downwards, and giant balls descended onto the retreating drow.
Oh god, this guy's coming down!
Buildings and elves, the landscape itself, all were pummeled by falling meteors, causing mass death and destruction. The devastation was so great and so loud, panic and terror overtook the entire city. Odoacer panted. He was completely exhausted. He had taken too much damage from the forces of Hargoneth and could no longer fight. Odoacer turned toward Apocalypse, his avenue of escape, but observed his loyal steed was laying on the ground, covered in protruding arrow quills. Poof! The nightmare disappeared into thin air. Odoacer surveyed the mayhem he had caused. The city looked as though an invading army had sacked it. But still, drow began picking themselves off the ground and advancing towards his position. Could Odoacer take on his devil form? No, he was too far drained to shift forms again. Odoacer resigned himself to his fate and drew out his axe. The Order of the Burning Fist veteran sighed deeply.
For Eldon!
For Eldon!
For King Doken!
The sounds of trumpets blaring and the beating of hooves filled the air as Sir Duncan and his men let out a battle cry. Odoacer heard clashing steel, beating hooves, and soldiers yelling as Ferelden's heavy cavalry cleared a path towards him. Sir Duncan led from the front, atop a destrier, his blade dancing side to side, spilling drow blood. He reached Odoacer and held a mailed hand out to him.
Come, my friend. Let's return to the castle before we are overwhelmed.
Odoacer hopped on the back of Sir Duncan's mount and saw waves and waves of drow soldiers approaching their location with haste. Suddenly, Duncan and Odoacer heard a familiar melody playing and were covered in shadows. Both warriors looked up to see 5 huge fireballs forming above them. The fireballs launched toward their enemies, simultaneously torching more drow. Both men turned around and saw King Swiftwater enthusiastically playing his flute.
Come on, boys. Let's go home.
Months later, Odoacer was still recovering from his wounds, and his eye socket was covered in bandages. He was laying abed when King Doken entered the room.
How do you feel, my friend?
I am getting much better. Any news on Marathi?
Yes, my scouts say she is quite pissed, and the reports say she no longer has the strength to strike Ferelden. Much of her army was decimated from your visit. You take risks, but you've done our kingdom a great service.
That is good to hear.
Doken looked back towards the door.
Odoacer, we have a visitor today. A strange halfling arrived in our city. He easily got past my guards, and Van Dag even tried to stop him, but he got knocked unconscious with a single blow, or so I'm told. The halfling demanded a meeting with me.
Odoacer sat up in anger, but grimaced at the pain from his wounds.
What did he want? What nerve to come into our city and strike like this at your commanders? I will kill this man myself.
Well, he seeks an alliance with Ferelden. This man claims to be a conqueror of some sort, and he intends to rule much of the world.
Where is he from?
He's from Dovah. He's from Dovah. King Lorian reigns there, and the Lorian dynasty has ruled those lands for a very long time. I told him that, but he just laughed and said Lorian's reign is coming to an end. And he actually wanted to speak with you. He's right outside the door.
Bring him in then.
A servant opened the door, and a halfling walked into the room, dressed in a red hooded cloak.
Greetings, Odoacer. I've heard a great deal about your attack on Hargneth, and have since learned of your trials and tribulations. My name is Maki. I represent a group that I formed called Vigor.
Okay. What do you want, little man?
Maki tossed Odoacer a pink gauntlet.
I want you. That gauntlet is a gift from Vigor. None of my champions are powerful enough to attune to it. I'd like to form a mutually beneficial relationship with you and King Doken. I'll explain everything.
That was the story Odoacer would tell me after taking me inside this tower cell. Please get me out of here. Bring me to my brother, Prince Landon Lorian.